The whole country witnessed the specter of pogrom violence in Delhi this February from afar. And you were there front and center, sometimes in the midst of the violence. So what did you see and how did you navigate this? I'd like you to take us through this set of images that were published in Caravan, photo essay of yours. So I'll just explain what exactly you saw.
Okay. So I had obviously been, I've been taking pictures at a lot of CAA protest sites, anti-CAA protest sites. And Shaheen Bagh was just one of them, which had, as we discussed, come up. So, there was a ongoing protest site at Silampur, and it had been around for, so it's the same duration that all the other protests had been going on for. So I'd been to that area before, and there'd been, stone pelting between some protesters at an earlier stage as well. So when the violence actually exploded on the 24th of February, I was actually at home, and the protests had been going on, and there was this pro-CAA energy which was being built up, like the men who were arriving with guns at protest sites, etc.
Right.
So there was always this undercurrent of something could happen, but one presumed, because there was such heavy deployment of police force, fully kitted out in riot gear, etc. You presume that it won't really go into something nasty like that. Right. But of course, then there's Goli Maro Salon Ko, and various other statements are made which drum up a certain kind of energy. So it's important to remember that the violence happens in that context, and despite a lot of police presence in those areas.
So it wasn't just a pushback, but some sort of a instigation that was happening from the.
I mean, it's made to look like it's spontaneous, but for it to be spontaneous, there were people who could have stopped it spontaneously as well, since they were there. So what happened then?
Right.
I wasn't there on the 24th, but we've all seen the images that came out from that day, especially Reuters, Danish Qureshi's,
famous,
Danish Siddiqui's, Danish Siddiqui's images. Horrific, obviously.
The famous picture of the man pointing a gun almost straight at the camera.
No. That's earlier. This is the image of the man being beaten up by a right-wing group of thugs, I guess.
Yes.
Very violently. So I was at home that morning, and I heard about the sort of beginning of the violence a little late, and I was on my own. I couldn't find someone to go in with, and it's tense enough in any case.
Right.
Sorry, there's another mosquito. So you tend to travel in groups, or at least with one person. Sure. But I couldn't find anybody who was trying to venture in. Right. And by that time it was too late. So I didn't head out on the 24th. That's when all of it exploded at a anti-CAA protest site, which was immediately vandalized from what I can see in the pictures, and burnt. And I saw another picture from that day which showed a policeman around. So it's not like it was an abandoned site which suddenly got overwhelmed by violent people. Right. There were people who could have possibly stopped it. Hundreds of phone calls were made. So the violence starts that day, and it's sporadic. Right. It's not a continuous wave of arson and murder. Right. So the next day, 24th, so 25th, I head back to the same place, and it's one long stretch of road under a metro line. Okay. And it was fairly deserted, but there were these two groups essentially on either side of like a no man's land that had been created by the forces, by the cops, by the police. And the Hindu side was active in sloganeering, and they were moving up and down on that side. Right. The side closer to Silampur was less aggressive at that point. They were. It was a little tense walking through. I'll admit. Okay. We were being looked at with glaring eyes, and we had cameras. So, but luckily we encountered a gentleman who recognized some of us from Shaheen Bagh and other places.
Okay.
And he told us to put our cameras inside because that would just incite people.
Right.
We complied. We walked up. He led us up till the police line, and then we crossed over into the no man's land as such.
Okay.
We hung around there for quite some time, thinking that things might flare up or things might happen, but nothing was happening. So we moved. I moved into the new Jafrabad colony,
Okay.
and for 10, 15, 20 minutes afterwards, we heard like a number of shots ring out and
Right.
pretty loud. So they sounded like some sort of weapon going off,
Okay.
um, and a mixture of tear gas as well, tear gas shells. And we went up to the roof to see smoke sort of rising from the road.
Okay.
And I ran down at that point because we wanted to go there. But as we got down, this two people were being brought in. One semi-conscious with a wound on his eyes. He'd obviously been shot at
And the
with
picture
something
that
on
we
the
see
side.
below in
Yes,
this
yes.
layout here.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a residential colony, as you can see. There's a
Right.
woman who's peeping out of her house to see what's happening. That's
Right.
actually literally in front of her house. The
This incident
man on
of
the scooter. The man is being put onto the scooter and taken
a hospital.
to a local clinic. Actually, that's directly in front of her house. So it's good to keep these things in mind that this is happening in places
In the
where
midst. Yeah.
people live. Yeah, it's not somewhere out there.
These are not
The
the
picture of
Badlands essentially. This is a central part of
yeah,
Delhi, which
exactly.
is or northeastern part of Delhi rather, but which is also
Yeah,
a deeply residential area.
yeah, of course. The image to the top right is what was the scene on the main road when we made our way out onto the main road. And the police wanted to they wanted to clear um, um, there was a CAA protest site here as well, anti-CAA protest site. They wanted to clear that, and that was what this confrontation was all about.
Right.
So the the sloganeering people had been removed, or they had left from that side, and the police had now returned towards the CAA protest site and wanted to clear that. And so this confrontation was essentially about them wanting to do a flag march right through.
Sure, but
And
in the midst of the violence, they were the authorities were thinking about clearing the
well,
anti-CA side.
yes, that's the thing. So because the violence had happened the day before, and then
Right.
there was sort of this lull in the middle,
Right.
and there was so much police force. This area had actually been peaceful. By peaceful, I mean calm.
Right.
There was no actual violence apart from these
Other than a
shots
little
that were.
agitation, maybe, I guess. Yeah.
Well, up till this point, when these people were injured, I mean, this Shahrukh seems to have been injured in the eyes. I'm not sure what happened to him.
Right.
I haven't managed to follow that up. But yeah, so this was the first sort of violence we saw on the 25th. And so this confrontation happens, and the police want to do a march. Thankfully, there are elderly and sensible people around
Right.
who calmed. It wasn't the police, from what I could see. It was civilians
From the community.
from the community who put themselves in the middle and tried to calm things down. And they did manage to calm things down, and the police walked through. They didn't clear the site immediately, but soon after we left, the site was cleared. Yeah,
Okay.
there are some
So-
pictures I put up on my Insta stories, which have those moments. Sort of, we can look at those later.
Yeah, sure.
So
Because for
this
me,
was
it's just it's fascinating that they were that they were still worrying about clearing out the protest sites in the middle of all this. Okay, yeah, please continue. Yeah,
that's a good point. So we can, I think, move on to the next spread from here. Yeah, this is actually yeah. So anyway, this was the 25th when I went in to Northeast Delhi for the first time after the violence began. And on the 26th, because there'd been a lot of violence in a place called Khajuri Khas, and so we walked along that road, and there was it was a road which didn't look like a road. It looked like it was only bricks and stones lying on the road, and there were shops which were gutted, and the material was strewn on the road. There was motorcycle shop, which pretty much every single motorcycle was lying on in a heap outside, had been thrown out and burnt to a crisp. So there was devastation everywhere. There was already talk. Sorry.
Almost
Yeah,
like
go
a
ahead.
war zone in a sense.
Yeah, it looked like a war zone. It really looked like a war zone. I believe the road was also not in the best shape, so it might have contributed to that that image.
Sure.
I only found out about that later, actually. When I first saw it, it really did look like a war zone.
Right.
Like it looked even worse than what it probably was.
Right.
So yeah, so we made pictures that day, and there was heavy police deployment. They were marching up and down. Nobody mentioned in any great detail any rooftop at that point that was used as a major launch pad of the violence. But soon, by the end of that day, stories start to come out about one particular rooftop that is used um, as a launching pad for several missiles. And the house belongs to Tahir Hussain, an AAP councillor from the area, apparently. So this was just being. So there were people talking about it, but nothing was being done about it. Like there was full police force over there. Right. The house was right there. They could have easily gone and checked this rooftop, but those 2 days nothing happens. And it's only when I'm sorry, I forget the exact date. These images should have it.
26th February.
26th, yeah. So 26th, when we go back, I find that this shutter is half up, and there are hundreds of policemen who are media people who are running up and down this building. So right. I made my way up there, and of course it was it looked like a site which had been prepared to attack. There were crates with what looked like Molotov cocktails of some sort. I sniffed a few of them, 10, 12, and they didn't smell of petrol or diesel, but right. It was some chemical of some sort, possibly right. flammable. There were stones on the rooftop that one found, obviously used to be used as missiles. Right. But I found it very strange that everyone was sort of traipsing around this property, picking up things, moving things around, looking at them. I mean, even myself included, and nobody was stopping us, because this, from what I could tell, was a crime site, right? It should be sealed off, and that's how you're going to get evidence.
I mean, if it was ground zero for this whole situation, then yeah, I mean, it could have been a very important space for sure to cordon off.
Exactly. So there was no cordoning, and despite full presence, in fact, senior cops had been coming up and down that road. Anyway, so that was the whole.
And no police official or anybody was posted there, or stopped media people, or even took accreditation or asked them who they were.
After a few hours, there was someone who was standing outside, and I left after that. Maybe they put the shutter down, but I mean, it had been at least 3 hours of people going in and out, and
and you can see in the middle picture in this series of 3 on the right, where there's a TV reporter who's pretty close to the evidence, so-called evidence, alleged evidence.
I can't only point to him. I was pretty close to the evidence also.
Sure. No, not to blame him, but I mean that all of you were close to the evidence.
Yeah,
as it were.
It was just left open, and there were policemen. They weren't stopping us, so it wasn't like we were breaking,
crossing any lines or anything like that.
Well, not really. The same day, Ankit Sharma's body was also taken out of the neighboring drain. This drain is actually right next to the building.
And you can see on the left, there's an image of his body being lifted out and brought over the wall.
Yes. And I mean, obviously, these are awful situations, and there's always family. And I mean, I can't even begin to imagine what that feels like. So this was the next few days of after the sort of the surge of violence was over, and the previous spread has sort of selection of images from a lot of the spaces which which were affected, schools which were burned. The top image, it sort of struck me a little more, because this wasn't even an actual house. This was a hut on the side of the road that people were living under, homeless people essentially, and even that was destroyed. It wasn't. I mean, it was just on the side of the road, so may as well let's have a go at it. I've been back there actually, and this family's actually rebuilt their space.
So it's basically a shanty that a homeless family was living in also that wasn't spared in the midst of all this.
Yeah, 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 and yeah, exactly. And I mean, the other images also are of targeted sort of violence. There are specific shops which were burned. There were the the whatever where they keep the money or something. Those drawers have been pulled out and opened. I wonder if they found anything.
Right.
Excuse me.
And you see in image number 5 as well, like the two shops on either side are spared, but the one in the middle has been gutted completely. And
Yeah.
sadly,
Well,
you see an Om painted on the one that wasn't touched. So, and I've seen.
yes, I mean, so that kind of signages you see, and sometimes they're spared, sometimes they're not. So it's
Right,
I mean,
right,
this is mob violence. It's not it gets out of control, right? So
right,
you can try and attack a certain shop, but I mean, the fire is not going to listen to you every time. In the bottom right image of a car parking lot, I was told actually more it belongs to a Muslim, and more Hindu people park their cars there, or the opposite. But it just tells you that it's going to affect everyone.
yeah, yeah,
At the
exactly.
end of
And
the day,
yeah, I mean, even Ganesha
so,
wasn't spared. This
yeah,
whatever
yeah.
happened.
Well, yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So we can maybe move further. Um, what This was interesting because this is 3-4 days now since
Right,
the initial violence,
right,
and one would imagine that with that many policemen, as you see from the bottom image, and they're patrolling all day,
right.
that things would be calmer, and people could maybe move out of areas where they felt unsafe.
Yes.
But the top image of the group of people walking out of this lane, it's it's quite surprising because until some of us ventured into this lane, it
Right,
was totally deserted. And I went up to take pictures of a go down which had been burned. And
right,
by the time I met a couple who were sort of emptying that go down, and they took me inside.
right,
And it was a Hindu couple, and they were obviously devastated because the
right.
entire go down had been burned.
Their entire life
And by the
probably burned down. Yeah.
yeah, and so by the time I came down, which was about 10 minutes, because I could hear a lot of noise downstairs,
Right,
and I wanted to go back
right,
quickly. So by the time I got down, there was 50, 70 people standing with their bags, uh, essentially had been waiting for outsiders to appear
right,
before they would
right.
come out this lane and literally cross a road and go into the other side where they felt safer, maybe at that point. This is right next to a masjid which was also attacked, called Meena Masjid,
Okay.
in where they're coming out of, the lane that they're coming out of.
So these are people who are so scared that they're literally cowering in their homes, waiting for
It,
some semblance or some indication of normalcy from outside before they sort of left and came out en masse.
it did it that is what we were told, and it did seem like that because they appeared in minutes, like everyone with their bags, and rushed out, as it were. um,
Right,
so yeah, I think this spread to me essentially talks about, despite police presence, despite the forces being there in full numbers, there was still a sense of dread, and a feeling of insecurity by the Muslim community, no doubt. Um, in fact, in this in all the Muslim dominated areas,
right,
it was quiet. There was nobody out protesting,
right.
or screaming, or
Or doing
in large
anything.
numbers, or doing anything really. But in this particular lane, after people left,
Yeah,
as they walked out,
right,
uh, a group of people did sort of accost a few journalists, people actually, who and were accosting them and yelling at them for being only interested in the Muslim story. I
right,
mean, they were trying to get to meet that the masjid over there, Meena Masjid, and they
right,
were being stopped.
right.
So the bottom image is actually a gentleman pointing that situation out to the forces, that maybe you should go and handle that. And well, they did, and they cleared the way actually. Then they could go
So
in.
then these are just irate people from coming out from spilling out from their homes and sort of engaging
I
in some
mean,
casual Islamophobia, I guess.
well, I wouldn't really paint it as simply as that, because there is, of course, a hell of a lot of Islamophobia and a lot of what they were saying.
Right.
But they're also victims because their properties are destroyed everywhere. It's not just Hindu properties or Muslim properties, and lives are affected. So it's everyone's insecure, and the feeling, what I feel is that it's the state's job to make you not feel insecure and make you feel safe wherever you are, whatever community you belong to.
Right.
So yeah,
and like you said, I mean,
this is close to the end of the month. This is 27th or so.
Yeah, and like you said, there were, you spoke to a Hindu couple that had had their go down gutted with fire as well. So a lot of different people were affected. The religion wasn't really featuring as much as it went on, and like you said, as the mob violence sort of went out of hand.
I mean, the numbers the numbers will say whatever they say, and these are slices of what I saw. It's not everything.
Of course, yeah. So yeah, just to remind people, yeah, this is your perspective on this. It's not, we're not trying to build a total image of or total story of what has happened there and explore all possible minute details. But whatever you've seen, you definitely attest to.
The top image on the left, from what I could tell from the nameplate, because the family didn't stop to speak, it was a Hindu house. But that's a lane which is dominated by Muslim houses, and pretty much every house in that lane is gutted. There's small shops that make jeans, tailoring units, motorcycle repair stores, things like that. There's down that lane is one guy who drives an auto who thankfully managed to save his auto, but his house was destroyed. So just to explain what these images are.
And the bottom, the complexity of the bottom image, continue please.
Oh, yeah, that's where it all began actually. That's the Shaheen Bagh protest site, the anti-CAA protest site, which was obviously gutted and destroyed the first day itself.
Yeah, and like you said, these are complex things, because you're saying there's so many businesses also that were destroyed. So many of those businesses would have been owned by Hindus or Muslims, and then they would have hired Hindus or Muslims as well. So a lot of people lost their livelihoods, a lot of people lost their homes, their workplaces, their businesses. And ultimately it shows how these things are not, while they might seem like, it could be targeted very clearly towards one thing. And it might have been in the beginning, as it unfolds, these things they cannot be controlled in any way.
Totally. Yeah. So, I mean, again, these are some of the people I was talking about actually. The auto driver, Shamshad, and of course the bottom center image of Asif Saikia, it stood out. I mean, meeting him stood out because all this has been about CAA and who's going to get to be a citizen and who's not. And of course, Assam has been one of the early test cases. So Asif is from Assam and who had come to Delhi a few decades ago, I think. And he had to go back to see if his name was on the list or not, or whatever was going to happen to him. And so he decided to shave, as he told me. He showed me his ID card where he looks, of course, completely different in a full beard. But he decided to shave because he felt that might make it easier for him when he goes back to Assam for this work. And of course, he comes back and his home is destroyed and looted, and livelihoods are destroyed, and it's all to do with the CAA. So it's sort of full circle in some ways on this poor man's experience.
And also the kind of alienation that you feel like you can't even express who you are and what your belief system is. You have to sort of hide it in a way just so that you feel safer. Another indication of how the state has kind of failed in ensuring that people feel secure, like you were saying earlier. And and you were talking about an auto driver as well. This is the same person that you said who managed to save his auto but lost his home.
His house was pretty much looted and burnt walls. So you have to start from scratch. And I met him later on, and as he was telling me that people are helping, which is, thank God for some kind people, they're helping, trying to get people back on their feet economically. They need medical help, legal help. There's a lot of help going in, definitely. But as he said, like, either he can stay at home waiting for this help to arrive because it's not announced, or it's luck that you meet someone. You met me and I helped you get a lawyer.
Right.
It's pure luck. So either you can be at home trying to figure these things out, or you can be out earning a living. He doesn't know which one to do. I met him a few weeks after, actually about a month after, and he was still figuring out how to get things off the ground, as it were. So it's tough. It's not easy getting back on your feet.
And each individual situation is tough in its own way and has its own set of challenges based on the people, the family, and what their individual. So there's no blanket solution for all these things as well. Did you see, when you were there, did you see any people of other communities helping each other out a little bit, maybe, sort of, safeguarding?
I was there. I was there at right after. So I might even have seen it, but I might not have noticed who's. I mean,
of course,
it's not like you can tell always.
Right.
So I'm sure it does exist. I'm sure there was help being provided. I refuse to believe that everyone is communal and bloodthirsty like that.
Of course.
And there was enough people who also were talking about, of course, local players as well, but outsiders involved in the violence as well. So there are stories you hear from what seem like fairly believable sources.
Right.
And I don't understand why anyone would really lie necessarily also.
Right. Yeah. So but still a complex situation. And then we move on to the last spread now.
Right. I mean, obviously there was death, and then the death has consequences for families. And this was two brothers who had been killed while they were on their way back home. They had not even been in the area. They were coming back home after sort of waiting for things to get calmer, and they were waylaid at some point and killed. You don't normally see. I mean, I don't normally make these sorts of images in Delhi. So the sort of situation and the images remind me of, as I think we were discussing at one point, of Kashmir.
Yeah.
And women coming out of the window watching, like a procession. I mean, it doesn't normally happen, right? So it's an outpouring of grief, and a community trying to stand together, I guess.
And also small, maybe just a tiny glimpse of what must be happening so often in Kashmir, and
oh, of course,
we don't even hear about a small percentage of it. Of course, thanks to these award-winning journalists and photographers who are working there, who have gotten into trouble for doing their job as well. So
of course, I mean, making these pictures here is nothing like making pictures
of course
similar to these in Kashmir.
Right.
Where your there are dealing with actual bullets all the time.
Right. And a lot of antagonism from the as well. And you told me an interesting thing about this picture on the top right, where you've purposely cropped out the faces of these women, and you said that there were a few other people around, other photographers as well, with you in this situation.
As it happens when when news stories break and things happen, if there are many media people, they converge, and it's quite a disturbing sight even when you're part of it. So I think I make these images despite despite not wanting to. I think many times. So anyway, this situation was much like that. There were a lot of people and a lot of cameras being pointed at these poor women who are obviously dealing with something pretty personal. But anyway, there's more space for personal in most of our lives anyway. I mean, at least working class lives. So we have some space to find in our houses, but if you live cheek to jowl, then I guess there is no personal. But yeah, having cameras pointed at you is an awful experience, I'm sure. So I really didn't want to show their faces necessarily, and I was really looking for a picture where I could hide their faces somehow,
but still convey the emotion.
During this, there are people fighting. Yeah, of course. Yes, but during this, there are people fighting to get, the right angle or the right shot. And there was an argument happening between a very senior lady newscaster and someone else, and I was bang in the middle, and there were
Right.
two sort of hands coming in front of me while they argued with each other, and I just wondered if that was the best place to have that discussion. Of course,
because I
no
always
one.
put myself in the other person's situation whom the camera is being pointed at, and if any of us was in a funeral of or rather on the day of the death of someone close in our family or in our family, and there was a camera. I mean, there were a bunch of cameras pointed at us. I mean, I don't know how we would
Oh yeah,
react to that
oh,
situation, especially given
exactly,
our privilege.
exactly. I mean, I've never been to a
The whole thing ends with this. We've looked at this image before because it has a lot of layers of messages on it.
yeah.
And you said you
I,
went back as well,
I
right?
think, yeah. So this actually, I went back to make this image also because this was on the 17th of March that I took this picture, because I just went back to the same areas. This is right next to uh, where the earlier pictures of the confrontation between the
Right,
police and some of the protesters was happening.
right.
So it's the same area, and I went back on the 17th, and this was it was still on these walls uh, many days after the violence had ended. And I went back recently after the lockdown began,
Right.
and as I noticed, some of the graffiti has been reinforced and rewritten, so it doesn't wash out too easily, I guess. Some of the hateful stuff,
Of
obviously.
course, yeah. The rest of
So
the
that
stuff was
that
white.
remained.
Yeah.
Oh, all the meaningful stuff that was saying on the walls of of Jamia University, some beautiful murals, paintings, artwork, meaningful artwork was of course painted over on the first day of the lockdown. So yeah,
So the lockdown was beneficial
tells you
for
what
some
people
at
are
least.
Oh, of course, all this disappeared. No one's even thinking about it. I'm not thinking about that. I mean, it's a blur to me sometimes.
So even a few months ago, you was before all this happened and before this project was something that became that started sort of formulating in your mind. You were there at Shaheen Bagh because you said it started because you were close by, and you were affected by the fact that the students were sort of targeted in this way. And then of course by Shaheen Bagh, and how inspirational it became for the whole of India, where there were suddenly hundreds of these kind of sit-ins all over the country, thanks to this one that sort of began the whole movement. So, what
Yeah.
was it
So
like being there?
my first sort of visit to Shaheen Bagh was on the night after I had made images at Jamia and the
Okay,
violence and the people coming out with their hands.
right,
And later that night, I think the 15th of December, later that night, a bunch of us walked towards Shaheen Bagh because we'd heard something was happening there also. Some violent reaction was happening there, and a lot of
right,
cops had been around. So by the time we get there, it was late, must have been around 10:30, 11, and it was very tense actually, because
okay,
there was a lot of stones on the road, like stones which have been pelted. There were barricades made, like sort of makeshift barricades which have been put up. It was cold, it was winter, so groups of people were sitting around small fires
right,
along this stretch of road, and we were not necessarily welcome immediately, because it was literally a barricade had been set up to keep someone away from there, obviously the
right,
police away from there.
right.
So when they saw the cameras, there was a little bit of easing up, and we walked towards what would then become Shaheen Bagh,
Right,
where the main stand was,
right. The
where these
actual,
images are made.
the main
The,
pandal where everyone was gathered.
the main pandal, exactly. It wasn't there as yet. There was just a bunch of um, women who were sitting on the ground, and they were surrounded by men, and there was a lot of tension in the air.
Hmm.
And I wasn't sure what was really happening and how. I mean, all I knew was that it was connected to they were protesting against the violence that the students had faced.
Right,
Um, but there had already been tension over here, so we weren't. I wasn't going to stick around too long. So I left that night, and I actually then go back to Shaheen Bagh only a few days later,
Right.
a couple of days later.
Right.
By that time, the pandal has come up, and it's a small pandal, and there are women who are protesting against the CAA and RC, and you know they're all they're all saying the same thing. It's very simple, that just take this law back and we'll go back to our home, because there's no need for this kind of a law,
That was
and also, of
essentially
course,
targeting. I mean, it was a targeted law.
it's a targeted law, exactly. So, and it targets their community, so they were out protesting. It was perfectly understandable. I don't see how people can attach all kinds of other motives to this. That they were.
And as you can see here, it's not just one community that was protesting it. There are a large number of intersection. There's a lot of intersectionality and a lot of other. I mean, of course, the entire Dalit community also traditionally oppressed and suppressed by the upper and so-called. I mean, I wouldn't call them upper, but so-called caste, upper castes, upper classes, and they all found a common ground, I guess, in this.
Absolutely. There were people from all kinds of groups that wanted to join with Shaheen Bagh, because Shaheen Bagh was inspirational in the way that it had brought so many different people together.
Right.
And their programming was vibrant. The speakers were it wasn't the usual speakers. If you wanted to speak, you got a chance to speak. Just go up and speak.
Right.
So it was a lot of freedom in a time of unfreedom,
and a reclaiming of public space as well. In a sense, because public spaces again in India are few and far between, and also very heavily policed if they are, and definitely not for all classes. So now you have a large.
This was the criticism. This was the criticism that people were throwing at Shaheen Bagh, that why don't they do this in a park? There is no park in Shaheen Bagh.
Exactly.
The only park is next to the metro line, and is maybe 10 feet by 20 feet. It's a strip. It's not a park. You could do that in Friends Colony or somewhere, where there's a community park.
Yeah.
But you can't do it. Most of.
Yeah, and it also shows how city planning and how all these things work, how institutional violence works on many different levels, and not just in obvious ways that you think violence would work. And here you see Chandrasekhar Azad, the famous self-proclaimed Ravan of Bhim Army. You're talking about
full swag. Huh? Full swag. I mean, he's got full swag. He knows how to, and he was a full hit. It was like a rock star entering the pandal, which was quite fun.
Yeah, I'm sure it was. And then, of course, the interlocutors, which was a last-ditch attempt by the state to sort of try and clear up this area.
This was a very strange situation. I'm sure. I know they were possibly trying to help, but they should have come possibly with a clearer idea of what they were going to do, because you already knew it was going to be in the open. There were going to be hundreds of people. Maybe instead of reading out in English, I know Hindi is not their strong point, maybe, but maybe someone should have read out the court document in Hindi instead. So this could have been done better, but anyway, it was what was.
Yeah, but again, the alienation that keeps coming back again and again. And I guess you can see people also, maybe kind of bewildered and puzzled about maybe what's happening or what's being said at certain times.
Yes, and I think what one has to continuously remind ourselves, since it was so long ago and so much crap has happened since then, that this was people who were out in at the height of Delhi winter.
Right.
And were camping out on the road every day at night when it is freezing. So it takes a lot of commitment. And there were times when I would be like, just go home, just give up. Because how long can you put yourself through this? But I guess I have the privilege of saying that because this law is not really changing much for me, or maybe I'm just not as committed as the women of Shaheen Bagh. I'm definitely not as committed.
Yeah, I think most of us in the country realize that we're not as committed as they are. Or they were.
Yeah. I mean, it was only COVID that put them back. No amount of gun-toting, vigilantes or armed cops. Like nothing stopped them, which is pretty commendable.
And then you had, of course, people there coming together and supporting each other in physical ways as well.
Yeah, it became much more than just a site where people were raising slogans. There was theater happening. There were people painting. There were installations. It's probably some of the most meaningful art I have seen.
Right.
There was a fantastic one where someone had put up just a cage,
Right.
and just to sort of allude to the detention centers
Right.
that would eventually be coming up, and everyone was posing for pictures inside the cage, which was weird.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean it
also,
worked.
yeah.
There was some fantastic graffiti made by students, by residents, there was a lot of community activity. There were people cleaning up the place. There was food being distributed.
And then
Sardarjis were coming.
And it reached also, I guess, sorry, Sardarjis were?
Had set up a langar. There were farmers who came from Punjab to express their support, packed into buses, who came all the way here, again, winter. And they stayed there to show support, which was, I mean, I haven't seen anything like that.
And it even attracted singers and influencers as well.
Exactly. Yeah, there was a mix of
selfie with Shaheen Bagh in the background.
Of course. It was also a safe space.
Right.
For men and women.
Right.
I was driving back late one night and I saw a friend of mine from school walking back, and she was with her friends. It must have been like 2 o'clock at night or 3 o'clock at night.
Yeah.
But she was walking back. These are not places where normally you'd see women out at 4 in the morning.
Yeah.
But it made the space safe. It was quite electric. I think I only remember one other moment when it felt like Delhi felt that kind of safe, was when we won the World Cup. And there was like a throng of people out on the road. There were women, there were men, everyone was dancing around, and it was quite electric. It felt like that. It felt like that kind of energy.
And then from there, of course, the pushback, and you have this became another big issue where students were pushing and the authorities were pushing back across barricades.
Yep. I mean, I like this. It's not a very well composed image in retrospect for me, because I actually wanted both the man folding the student folding his hands in front of the cops, and the women holding on to the baton here.
Right.
So I ended up cutting the guy off a little stupidly, but I mean, I can't say enough about these students. I don't remember a time when any of my friends were doing anything like this, or maybe I was just doing the wrong things in college, obviously, and not concerned with the world. No, it's true. I probably wasn't concerned with the world, but these are people who are concerned enough to put their body on the line.
Literally, yes, exactly. That is the thing, right? They put their bodies on the line.
Yeah. Yeah, so there was a series of pictures which came out around this time. There was a girl being pulled in 5 different directions on top of the barricades.
Right.
And so I climbed a tree close by, because when in doubt, always climb a tree. Right. So I had a vantage, and you could hear very clearly what was happening. And in that madness, I mean, obviously the students are upset and angry, and the cops are trying to be, claim that they were trying to be, patient.
Right.
but you start yanking someone from 5 different directions, and it just amps up the anxiety at that point, and everyone piles in, and it just goes out of control. So who's helping that situation go out of control? It's always the ones with a danda.
Yeah. I mean, the danda, the protective gear, and all the other stuff, that they have.
Yeah, that was quite scary to see, because you don't see, this is a student protest. This is not some, I don't know, hardcore political rally or something. Literally,
these were not riots either. It was just a
these
protest.
Are not riots.
Yeah, and which we are well within our rights as Indians to do, and they were well within their rights, of course, to do.
Absolutely. What my images, these ones don't seem to show, or don't show, that there's a line of buses which have all come full of cops to control a bunch of maybe a couple of hundred, not even, students. So it tells you how scared the state was of this moment, of this situation,
and how disproportionate the reaction was to what was happening.
Of course, yeah. Well, I think it was proportionate to how
everyone feared,
how scared they were, maybe. Yeah.
And then, of course, so this is how, I mean, you can see the kind of determination by a lot of these things that cropped up.
I love this line. Yeah. I love this line. I've seen it on a few other places in the city, and it was perfect. Because you just don't see the, maybe not Akhbar as much as
TV news, I guess.
Akhbar is still thoda better, but
we get the feeling of it, and it's so true. It's so true that that what they're saying, of course, for people who don't read or understand Hindi, is that the walls speak more truth than the news. And I'll paraphrase it as news rather than newspaper. But yeah. And then speaking of talking about news and how news sort of twisted things so badly, we all saw these videos of the police coming into into JNU and into the library, where people were literally trying to protect themselves, or just studying or doing the normal things that a student would do in a library, which is not in any way threatening to anybody else. And like you said here very clearly, there are many of the police and perpetrators of violence on those days have gone scot-free, despite being caught on multiple cameras with clearly identifiable features being seen. While students and other people are even till today, or even till recently, as a couple of weeks ago, under the veil of this pandemic, being arrested. And
yes, absolutely. No, I mean, I think the whole point of the police seems to be just to beat people up, because there are so many images, so many videos of them breaking CCTV cameras, destroying public property, assaulting people. For what? I can't even understand. They're trying to catch them, and then once they've caught them, they'll beat them. So during this CA in Selampur, there's a bunch of images I made of this kid who got caught by the cops. And there are like 8 burly cops running towards this one 10-year-old, 11-year-old. So so it's disproportionate to what is your intention? You want to stop that boy from throwing stones. Okay. Stop the boy from throwing stones. As I heard one cop yell out to his colleagues that stop throwing the stones back at them, because if you throw the stones back at them, they'll only throw it back at you. And that made full sense. He was an older cop, so obviously a little more sensible, it seems. But none of the cops listen to that, right? So everyone is busy throwing. It's retaliation. Like, "Tune mujhe thappad mara, now I will slap you back." Like,
then it becomes a very animistic kind of reaction. You're really reacting from something inside rather than sort of a rational way that that you realize first of all what you're there for.
Like, behave like a professional police force. You're supposed to
peacekeeper.
They're doing as a peacekeeper, exactly. I mean, I think their only job seems to be crowd control. They're very bad at it also.
Yeah, which is what I was laughing about. And then, of course, you were in the, the library incident became very famous and went viral all over the country. A lot of people have seen these images, seen visuals of it in various forms, right from CCTV cameras to photographs and images from people's cell phone cameras. But, and of course, we know that the head of the student body of the JNU also was attacked, very brutally and hit on the head.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of things that happened. But this, of course, Ishan, you went to the library right after it happened, I guess, right?
Yes, we went the next, or the day after the next, and there were blood spatters on the floor. Pretty much everything had been upturned. All the chairs were upturned. Like, it made no sense. It looked like some rioting had happened inside, but the only rioting that happened was by the cops.
Yeah.
So the cops came in and trashed the place, basically.
Yeah.
So, and on camera.
And you can see, of course, sorry.
I like this sign that someone had left. I don't know who had left it, but it stood out in that.
Hum Sab Hindustani, which is, I think, it says a lot. But yeah, and then you again, like you've seen the kind of destruction. This is a library. Again and again, we have to remind ourselves: this is a library. You can see people's bags, books, everything, notes. People have probably gathered, studied for months.
Did not go off here. Exactly. A bomb did not go off here. There was no earthquake, but a police force came in here to empty it out. So, and then that's what they did.
This results in this, and blood, of course, was spilled. It's obvious here in this picture that blood was spilled as well, and blood being spilled on literally on lecture notes or notes that people are taking to learn something, which is staggering to the mind. And of course, this is one of my favorite pictures from this set. I mean, for obvious reasons, of course, but like you said, they didn't even spare the PM.
Yes, it was absurd. I mean, like the whole point of that exercise was lost on me. Like, was it only to scare the students? Because if you wanted to scare the students, you could have done it in many other ways. And look what you sparked off after that. Because of this one thing, look what you sparked off after that.
It was a really intense situation, and where people were genuinely injured. People was, like you've shown here, people are struggling to get home. Students just leaving their own campus with their hands up. I mean, it's absurd. And then, of course, other things.
And the protests after that.
And the protests after that, because, of course, these things don't happen in a vacuum. There is some sort of a reply that happens in these situations.
Well, I think the reply was Shaheen Bagh, and that was a befitting reply to the way the police and the state had behaved.
You can see that these are people who had absolutely nothing to do with either side. Of course, had some sort of a vested interest in the form that yes, these laws would affect them directly. But over and above that, they were also standing up for people around them in their own city, around students as well. And which brings us to the last, even in this particular set, which is true. No one is illegal. I mean, a human cannot be illegal by the sheer force of their existence. It's not possible. And and this, of course, there was also this other thing where you went to UP, and during this time, and you showed us images from there as well, where and this is a heartbreaking image. I'll run through these very quickly because I don't want to spend too much time, but this was a really heartbreaking image for me to see. When I saw this timetable, and I've also made timetables for myself growing up, even recently, to sort of get my schedule in order or whatever. And then it's such a normal, everyday thing that a human being does. And you see this poor little boy has,
well,
the worst of.
Well, for me, I never made timetables, so it stood out for that reason, that there was commitment here. There was someone who was trying to do something to change something, to change his settings, to change his life, as it were. And that stood out to me even more, that life was snuffed out for absolutely no reason. In fact, all these deaths that these pictures might talk of, or we'll talk of here right now, seem so inconsequential right now. Because they'll be forgotten so fast.
Exactly.
Even I won't remember them in a few years, because there'll be a pile of other bodies that we'll be talking about by then. Which makes it
bodies. And then and these new incidents just bury the past, and then there's then and it keeps going on in this vicious cycle of.
Yep. And these are kids who were picked up in one incident, and like a whole bunch of them were picked up together, and were obviously beaten up uh, and terrorized for the duration of a couple of days before they were let go of. And the same things you see now of people being brutalized when they stepped out to go and get some, I don't know, ration or food or whatever. I can't make sense of it, quite honestly. It all becomes a blur after a certain point.
And of course, I will link these stories so you can go and check them out. They were published by Huffington Post, as you can see here, and Caravan, and elsewhere as well. So you can actually go and see the details of these stories and read about these children who were literally targeted, by the authorities in Uttar Pradesh. Doing this for 6 months now, you've been constantly exposed to this kind of trauma. You've experienced and seen and witnessed lots of trauma in the years gone past. How do you cope? How have you been coping with this constant exposure?
Not entirely sure. I think it all feels like a bit of a blur, and maybe that is a defense mechanism. Maybe that is a coping mechanism that's happening, because even when I'm talking about it right now, I'm sure there are like a ton of details that I could have added to this conversation, but I seem to be fast forgetting them. So maybe photographs are good. And there's a reason that we need them, because we tend to forget by design to
survive. I mean,
I think to survive, to stay sane at one level. So yeah, I think that's been happening. Definitely been blocking stuff out, but apart from that, I really haven't thought of it too much, to be honest.
Processed it, yeah. But yeah, maybe it's something for another time. But yeah, I guess.
I think the processing will continue to happen. I think we forget. That's the problem. I'm forgetting the NRC and the riot time, because I'm seeing so much right now which will keep me occupied and keep me thinking about right now.
And we all know, I mean, as visual people, we tend to, I don't know, these images that are recent tend to run in our heads a lot more, maybe with a lot of frequency. But then, like you said, they get replaced by other images that then run through our head. And sometimes, of course, the images from the past do come and they sort of take a forefront in your mind and thing. But it's hard to, like you said, when you're constantly doing it, it's very hard to sort of be present in all those moments simultaneously. Would be something that would break any of us.
But I think they still have a way they end up affecting. So like the pictures of loss of people dying during the pogrom, it sort of one of my early assignments was when I used to work for an afternoon paper called Today, and I had been told to go to some corner of the city because there'd been a triple murder. Okay. So I mean, I barely started taking pictures, so I really didn't know much about photography or about those kinds of situations. But I found myself at the doorstep of someone's house, and there were 3 siblings who had killed themselves and hung themselves. I couldn't go. I couldn't go in. I couldn't take any of those pictures because it seemed pointless to me, quite honestly. Like, what was the point I was serving here?
Yeah.
But of course, there was a lot of media in there, and everyone's a hawk. So you take a picture. I mean, I actually didn't even take a picture. I just didn't go in. But it sort of reminds you every time I'm in one of those situations, I do think about that first time, where maybe a little more thought went into that, where I thought about it a little more.
Right.
Now I might take that image first and then think about it afterwards, which I'm not sure is always the best thing to do. I'm not sure. I don't know.
But then instinct does take over, and I guess in those situations, I mean, it's hard to sort of put aside all that instinct and then sort of hit the pause button or whatever.
Yeah, I think I'm just trying to look for the quieter moments. Maybe since I don't work for anyone necessarily, I don't have someone telling me, hey, why don't you have that picture or that picture?
And you're not a sport news or a daily news photographer in that sense. I mean, in the strictest sense.
I haven't been for some time, yes, but currently it feels that's exactly what I'm doing now, out every day doing sports. But yeah, so
yeah, it is this thing, but I think it's an interesting time to talk about just after we have spoken about communalism and this thing in so much detail, through the pictures and other ways. Uh,
I think it's more difficult to tell political leanings, as it were, in photographs necessarily. Not in single photographs. It's very difficult to tell,
right.
And it's very difficult to uh, uh, sort of make an image say something that you want to, especially in new situations. You know, you don't know who that person, that the person holding that gun could be. Could be a anti CA protester also. Who knows? You know, at that point. So you just take it. But how those images then get used further is not in your control. So I think there's a limit for single images, for spot news images at least. To say that was motivated by something would be difficult. But I mean, I have been noticing, like all of us possibly have been noticing what people around us, what they believe in, what they feel when certain things are happening, like say the clanging of the thalis. Again, the problem is not that you want to express solidarity, but how that solidarity is being asked of you, and how you respond to that asking. So yeah, I've been noticing people around me, and I've what I noticed during Shaheen Bagh was I didn't see the usual faces that I see at every news event as frequently as I did a few names, a few people, and largely they were freelancers or people who work for themselves. And especially in Shaheen Bagh and CA during that time, a lot of students who were putting their work out. So I think, yeah, that absence of certain faces and certain people that one would normally see on the ground, yeah, I did notice that at some points.
So yeah, it is pretty hard, and but I guess in some level it creeps through, in something, even if it's just the thoughts that are running in your mind, it's hard to sort of separate them out from, and then suddenly magically be, objective in what you're doing. And this works both ways. Let me not point fingers at any one side. We are subjective as well, whatever our beliefs and leanings are, so these things are harder to, I guess, they're harder to tell. So now, I'd like to move on to, possibly one of your most important projects from the past, at least, A Peal of Spring Thunder. And, it started back in 2008, if I'm not wrong, and I'm sort of quoting you now. Back in 2008, after working in the interior villages of central India, I came back to Delhi with falciparum malaria, typhoid, and jaundice, all three together. I spent weeks in the hospital, coming as close as I ever would want to come to confronting my own mortality. Now, photojournalists are in dangerous situations from time to time, to the point where we've even unfortunately lost someone our colleague Tarun Sherawat to illness contracted on the job. Now, tell me about this time in your life when you were ill. What was going through your head, and it's an assignment that almost killed you, but also something that sparked off one of your most important bodies of work, which is Peal of Spring Thunder.
So I didn't know Tarun. I hadn't been at Tehelka at that point when he was there. Right. I wish that had been different. I wish I had been at Tehelka at that point, because maybe my experience would have sparked a bulb in my brain, and I might have pointed out something to him. But yeah, so I was working for India Today at that point, and after many months of persuasion, my colleague Shatarupa, who was the writer for the story, and I managed to convince that we needed to go to Chhattisgarh, because this is during the Salwa Judum, the peak of Salwa Judum, 2007, 6, 7.
Terrifyingly horrible that was for the people who lived there.
Right. So that was the motivation, that we need to go and see what's happening and do stories out of there. we were very enthusiastic, both of us, and
Right.
we possibly didn't take all the precautions necessary. And so, yeah, so I came back with a reasonably deadly combination of diseases, but also realized that is probably the most common way that people die across this country.
Yeah.
And yeah, confronting mortality does spark things, I guess, and it did spark an interest in me in wanting to go back into that space. And I wasn't only then sort of interested in the Maoist um, the images of the Maoists and the Naxals and the
Right.
so the
Which became the predominant narrative coming out of there for a period of time. I
which was the reason that I had gone there
Right.
in the first place. I
Right.
mean, I won't
And
make
we're looking
anything
at
up.
pictures from that first trip for those who are wondering.
Yeah, so you realize that the story is much more than just the gun-toting people.
Right.
It's not just the Maoists; it's the people who live there that actually make the story, or whose story is more important. So, of course, at this point, the Salwa Judum had been um, active, and people from villages had basically been corralled into camps that had been set up by the state.
Right.
And the ones who were left behind in the villages couldn't step out of the villages because they were afraid of being seen as Maoists or Maoist supporters and being killed by the Salwa Judum people. And similarly, the people who had left the villages found it difficult to go back. So this was the atmosphere that we arrived in when I got there. And the jail, actually, this is the jailer from Dantewada jail. There'd been a jailbreak. I don't know, some 80, 90 people had escaped from the jail.
Wow. Okay.
So it was a very cursory, a very sort of superficial trip in that sense.
Right.
What we had intended to find, uh, we didn't get access to the Maoists. They didn't come talk to us.
Right.
It became a slightly hair-raising situation because the villagers didn't know who we were. They didn't
Right.
want us to leave before we were vetted by the Maoists.
Right.
That otherwise they could be accused of allowing spies to come in, etc. So we were sort of held against our will for a few days in this village. I mean, it was all peaceful,
Right.
but there was underlying tension that no, you can't leave,
Right.
which then became a little well, disconcerting, because we really had to leave because we were running out of resources, and we had also told home that we'd be back at a certain time. So that was my first experience. That's the hut that I stayed in, and I'm presuming got malaria in. So it's also the first time I saw the
The stars, which seem to
stars.
be a recurring theme then later on in your imagery when you've gone back as well. Like, I mean, you
Yeah,
can't ignore
so
this, of course. A sky full of stars is difficult to ignore, but
this image, I think, is a mixture of a bad CCD screen as well as stars. I have a feeling, because it just seems so unreal.
Yeah.
In fact, I showed some of these star images to a to cosmologist. No, what's it called?
Astronomer.
Astronomer, yeah. And he pointed out various constellations. So it made me believe that okay, those are actual stars. It's not just the overexposed screen.
And what I forget what they call those things. Yeah, but yeah. So yeah, and then like you said, that normal life is still going on, even though this has a one story. It's not just one narrative as we see in every place that we go to. I guess there's never just one narrative.
Right.
This is, I guess.
So yeah, so this was the first. This was my first excursion into Chhattisgarh, and I was, as I said, stuck in one particular village, and we weren't really allowed to move because we weren't vetted. So we'd essentially hang around that one space and see whatever. So there was a hut which happened. So I'd go and take some pictures there and come back to the hut.
Right.
Once before we had gone in, actually we had tried to go to all the camps, all the Salwa Judum camps.
Okay.
And essentially the Salwa Judum was a bunch of young people who had been handed guns and weapons and told to fight on behalf of the state. Now you can imagine what happens when you hand guns and authority
Right.
to some people in a village and not others.
Right.
You know, it's bound to have
There's going to be a power
consequences.
discrepancy, and then of course.
Absolutely, yeah. In fact, just before this particular image was taken, we were stopped at a checkpoint, and I rolled the window down, and in came a 303 rifle
Wow.
pointing at us, and it was a kid. I mean, he couldn't have been more than 15,
Right.
16 at max.
Right.
And instinctively, maybe it was a stupid thing to do, but I sort of smiled and laughed a little, like, like what are you pointing a gun at?
Yeah.
And for, and he was very, he was taking it very seriously. He wasn't like, he didn't break because of my laughing and smiling. He
Right.
took it very seriously, and we had to sort of calm him down and talk our way out of that. That he wasn't going to shoot us, but
Right.
that's the kind of situation you have created
Yeah.
by handing weapons to people who don't know what to do with them necessarily, you know,
and
and are
untrained
not
militias. I mean, nowhere in the world has an untrained militia, been disciplined enough to know what to do when and do the right thing at the right time.
Yeah, exactly.
So
I
anything is
mean,
possible.
the whole Salvajudum idea comes from Vietnam, etc., where
Right.
similar strategies have been tried. Whatever strategic hamleting, I think it's called.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it had disastrous consequences.
Yeah,
Over the
sure.
years after that, I basically wanted to engage with the larger story, and I really didn't want to necessarily do it as a journalist.
Right.
You know, specifically, of course, many of the trips I made were on assignment, and then after that, I was lucky enough to get a small travel grant, which allowed me to travel for a few months. So those I did on my own without any real specific sort of purpose. I wasn't looking for an image or a particular story. I was
Right.
literally just placing myself in those situations.
Right.
And I wanted to see both Bastar as well as North Chhattisgarh, because North Chhattisgarh is more industrialized in that sense. They're mines.
Right. I mean, the
Whereas
iron ore and
Bastar is
bauxite and everything.
exactly some of the largest mines are in North Chhattisgarh, which also then connected to other projects I was doing with on mining. But so I basically wanted to position myself in situations in villages where people had been arrested on frivolous charges, in in mining towns where land had been taken from villagers in lieu of jobs, etc. And now they were basically working as labor on their own land,
Right.
effectively. So I wanted to place myself in these situations and see what came out of them, without structuring it that I'm looking for, I don't know, death, or I'm looking for people who've been wrongly accused. I literally was not looking for anything, and so this lot of images emerged from that sort of a
It was a slow exploration where you
yeah
were letting one thing lead to the next in a natural, organic way rather than sort of force fitting it into some sort of narrative that you had read before or wanted to bring in or whatever.
yeah attempting to, at least, yes.
Okay.
I think a lot of the pictures on screen right now, the contact sheet,
Right.
I actually had gone on an assignment for Open magazine,
Yeah.
in which I'd spent some time with a platoon, with a group of Maoists in Gadchiroli, and I had made a lot of pictures on film for
Okay.
myself, as it
Right.
were, and then I forgot about those. I had shot about whatever 20, 30 rolls,
Okay.
and I forgot about them quite literally,
Okay.
and they lay in my cupboard for many years after that. And so I'd only been looking at the digital stuff, and it had a certain feel to it.
Right.
And then I was clearing my cupboards, and I came across this bunch of negatives, rolls which had not even been washed actually.
Hmm.
And I gave them, and all this came out of there, and that actually restarted.
I guess it
An
injected
interest.
a fresh visual thing as well into the story.
Yes, I think it had a bunch of images which were different than what I had shot for the magazine. They were not as pretty necessarily, or
Right.
they weren't as perfect in some
Mm.
ways, which I thought lended
Yeah.
to a longer story,
Yeah.
much better. And I've been trying to put it into some sort of a book. I'm really bad with text, so it takes me hours and ages, and I
But
still haven't managed.
having said that, I mean, of course, you do write very well. Of
Oh no,
course,
this is
self-deprecatory as usual.
no,
But
no, 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 no.
and I'm
Trust
just
me.
going to quote one thing that you've said. While I hope my pictures tell something of the story of resistance, I also want to portray people so that they are able to see and recognize themselves rather than as stand-ins for great sweeping themes, embodiments of conflict. This, above all, is intended to be a project about people, not symbols. So these last two sentences, of course, find a lot of resonance with me. This is a pet peeve that I have, where people often use human beings as reductions of great themes, and then not, talk about the people at all in any way, or look at them as individuals in any way. So why is it imperative to see the person standing in front of us rather than the theme that he or she is supposed to represent?
I mean, I don't know if it's. I think it just gives you a truer sense of, if you can make an image which someone who is living the experience can see some truth in, then I think you're close to some kind of truth. I mean, we're never going to be,
Yeah,
100% spot on
it's
truth.
not possible.
It's always going to be this is not an Adivasi story. This is my story of an Adivasi's life. I am not an Adivasi.
Yeah.
I'm never going to be, however much I try, I will, sadly, the differences between our lives are such that I'll never be a local. I'll never be someone who can tell their story. I'm only telling, I think, my story of what I see.
Right.
So one hopes that when someone sees these pictures and they're from, their protagonists, as it were,
Right.
that they don't see these as alien,
Right.
as
Right.
they don't make them seem alien to themselves, as it were. I don't necessarily know how to do that. I don't have the answers. The line that you read is more a mission statement, as it were. Something that one aspires to.
Right. And to keep reminding yourself as well that
Yeah.
what I'm trying.
Yeah, exactly. You have to keep reminding. In fact, there'd be times when I'd look at some images and be like, this is really this is the wrong approach. I might have done it not thinking about it, not paying as much attention to it while I was making those pictures. So it's something to remind yourself. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. And also speaks about the importance of local voices, telling their own stories, which is, I think, a shift that really desperately needs. It's happening in a slow way, but it desperately needs to happen, because I, for one, not to put down you or anybody else, but I, for one, would like to see an Adivasi talk about or have the same platform or the same ability to tell these stories visually or writing or whatever way they want to in whichever language, and sort
Absolutely.
of enable us also as outsiders to have a deeper understanding of their lives as a result. So
absolutely. I mean, I haven't. I'll admit I haven't managed to do a lot of that as yet, but I think a certain amount of giving back, as it were,
yes,
like, I don't know, engaging with um, young people, students, etc., from these from wherever you are
exactly.
working, whichever area that might be a good way to give back. We don't have established platforms, so everyone has to start from scratch, as it were.
Yeah.
I haven't done it as yet, but that has been part of many many proposal grants I've written, sadly not received. But yeah, I think training, interacting, not even training, I think there's a lot to learn as well as teach.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, for sure, to learn. I think that's a very important point you made. Yeah, please continue.
Yeah, no, that's
yeah, and I mean, this is something that it's a personal thing as well. This is something that even I've been trying to work on for the last couple of years, to see how we can actually create these platforms to do this and bring people up on an equal footing. So then they have the same ways and means of telling these stories that we do as well. And it's a tough ask.
Enabling someone with whatever basic things.
Exactly.
I mean, just simple things like a camera or
exactly,
an internet connection can go along. You don't have to do much more, as it were.
Yeah, and not getting caught up in these old, these traditional ways of, oh, images need to be this way or be that way, or, based on some old white guy who's done it that way or whatever, and going beyond
Sure.
that, because they might see things in a completely different way that would be, amazing. I mean, I think so, at least. And whatever
Yeah,
little I've seen
absolutely.
where people have told their own stories or been enabled or given the same platform to tell their own stories, I've been amazed by the perspectives and the way that they've looked at it, either visually or in terms of their thought processes as well, which is
Mm-hmm.
important, I think. So yeah.
Yeah.
But moving on with this, of course, we're looking at now. These are all, I'm guessing, film images from the way they, the textures and the things they're seeing.
The black and whites largely are. The color, of course, is not.
Very
That's digital.
powerful image, a very powerful portrait again. The bottom right one. There are
Yeah,
many.
and the bottom, the top image though, sort of spoke to me much more because we were about to leave the camp, and
Right.
she suddenly decided to repack her bag. Now these are
Right.
tiny bags which barely have much space, right? And then she took out all these little things, and I mean, apart from the gun and the magazine, everything else is hardly what you find in a in a gorilla's backpack. There's a plate and a mug. There's a little notebook. There's some letters. There's some photographs. The notebook is in a plastic bag because obviously rain,
Greens,
etc.
yeah.
It it was and it was an insight into that person as opposed to that Maoist,
Absolutely.
and that person was at the end of the day, whatever, 18, 19-year-old young girl
Who just
has,
happens to be in this
yeah,
situation.
exactly. In a lot of and a lot of the people when I spoke to would say that the bet this is the best situation to be in, because if we don't have this gun, then we don't have any respect, and we
Right.
don't have any rights, as it were. So this way we have them. And of course it's a complicated idea,
Of
and
course.
there are ways of arguing against it, of course. But when a 17, 18-year-old person is telling you that, uh, while you're looking at the remnants of her bag which have letters to her mother, sorry, mosquitoes, uh, it breaks it down into things which are more real. And I,
And
this was an actual pure all out assignment for open.
oh, okay.
We just happened to get access. This was um, actually it's funny that you mentioned Arundhati Roy, even though this was not a part of going with her, not part of that piece that she wrote, the
Right.
Long March.
Right.
Uh, but there were similar experiences, of course. So to get in when we were making contact, we almost didn't make it actually because there was torrential rain,
Okay.
and so yeah, so these bunch of images were largely from from towards Gadchiroli, near Gadchiroli somewhere. Um, the color ones that you're looking at right now are from Bastar, though, from from a different time. But these ones in Gadchiroli, we made contact, and we were supposed to meet someone who would help us sort of go into the forest at Hemal Kassa, which is a ashram run by Baba Amte, where
Okay.
it's a hospital and ashram for abandoned and injured animals as well. It's a beautiful space. Anyway, so we were supposed to be there, meet somewhere there. Anyway,
Sacred.
and
It's a sacred forest, if I'm not wrong. It's a sacred forest as
sorry,
well. It's a sacred
it's a
forest.
sacred forest. Yes, I think most forests in that sense would be sacred to the Adivasis.
Yeah.
I could be wrong there, but yeah, there's something to that effect. So we were supposed to get there in the morning, but it was raining really hard, and like the roads were flooded, and our driver, who we had got from Nagpur, he got sick at
Oh,
night, and we were in the middle of nowhere, heading towards our destination, and we decided that it was probably a better idea to continue going in towards the hospital, because that was a hospital, and the driver would get some medical help.
right.
And it seemed like he had malaria because he was shivering and we've all had it. I've had it before. This was my second trip. The first time I felt sick, so I
Were you
I was
were you
aware of malaria.
were you apprehensive about it? I mean, having suffered
I
so
was very apprehensive. I was very, very apprehensive because the first time around had been very rough. And like with everything, when you get sick, it's rougher on everyone else.
Yeah.
Also, I mean, you of course go through it, but
Yeah.
my mother was on her own. It was quite nightmarish for her. I mean, that was, yeah, it was pretty bad.
Right.
I was talking gibberish, and I was totally hallucinating. I had 107 degrees temperature, so
Oh wow.
I was totally talking gibberish. Though I
Yeah,
must say
those
it
are
was
things that definitely are not going to like leave you so easily.
Yeah, no, I kept telling my mother that don't worry, I have that some scientists have planted some chip in my brain, and that's what's making me sick. And the minute they take that chip out, I'll be fine. And I think poor woman must have been looking at me like, "Ye to pagal ho gaya hai."
Yeah.
So yeah, so that was the first time. So this time around, I was definitely nervous about the health
Were you
consequences.
more prepared? Did you take some
I
quinine
was
or something?
no, I didn't take the malarial medication because apparently if you get falciparum, you get falciparum anyway. So
Right.
I was basically taking precautionary measures such as wearing full sleeves, making sure I had a mosquito net at night, things like that.
Right.
Also, water cleaning tablets, iodine tablets and things like that. Yeah, so I was apprehensive, but um, I guess reasonably confident
Right. But
that
still
that'll be
pushing
fine.
forth through that.
Yeah. So to get back to what I was saying, that it was raining really hard, and we encountered like flooded roads. Our driver was sick, so I took over the driving. I had never driven a large vehicle before. It was like a SUV type thing. That was the first time. It was fun. But we drove through pretty flooded parts, and we made it. But we were about 12 or 16 hours late. So we were convinced that whoever had been waiting for us, now too there's no chance. We'll probably have to go back unhappy.
Right.
But like in Arundhati's story, in Arundhati's write-up, she writes about how to meet her point of contact, she had to have a banana. He was going to have a banana, but he ended up eating the banana because she got late. So we didn't have. I think we had a bottle or something we had to hold. But so whoever was waiting for us waited longer because they realized that it was raining and it was going to be tough. So thankfully they waited and met us once we got there. Just by chance, we were actually driving around looking for anyone to talk to us, and then someone did come up and talk to us, and suddenly you realize that you were actually surrounded by many people which you hadn't noticed.
Right.
Pure typical guerrilla.
Yeah, of course. Camouflage in the jungle.
Camouflage, yeah. So it was, so that's how we went in, and then we spent some time with the group in these pictures. Yeah.
And this is a separate trip, like you said, to Buster.
This was actually a trip right after there'd been a horrific attack by the Maoists on the CRPF.
Okay.
76 soldiers were killed.
This is a famous one. Yes, I remember reading about
yeah.
it.
I was surprised to know this, but I think it's one of the most lethal strikes against a trained armed force, even in compared to even Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. No one situation has led to that kind of
Loss
death.
of life. Huh?
So this was immediately after that, about a week after that or 10 days after that. It was almost like a press con organized, and we met one of the people who was part of that organizing raid.
Okay.
So this was in that time, yeah.
Okay.
Actually, if you go back to the earlier image, maybe I'll say one more thing.
Sure.
The next one. So these images were made like in the morning, and like with everyone wants to tell their story and wants to control your narrative some way or the other. So just like that, the Maoists also do every time I've met them, they'll always do a exercise session where, they'll exercise and you can take pictures of that. And I always find it kind of silly because just living in those forests and walking the kind of distances that's evident
You don't need to
that you are
train.
very fit. You don't need to do, like whatever it is that you're doing. So I would always, and there's a performance sort of aspect to it.
Right.
I've always felt. So I'm generally a little cagey about taking those pictures, or at least I became cagey. And around this time, I actually took another picture, which I'll just share with you, which shows, because I was not the only press photographer around. There were others as well. And this image stayed in my mind because I then saw it on the cover of a magazine later on. But this gentleman had positioned himself on the ground. He was lying on the ground, the photographer, and he had asked all these exercising Maoist soldiers to come towards him and point their guns at his wide-angle lens as he lay on the ground, to get this, I guess, like some sort of funnel effect of the guns, right? And it was just the most ludicrous sight I have seen in the middle of a forest. Like there are you're dealing with like serious things. Like 76 people are being killed, but this guy is busy orchestrating this image. I know why he's doing it, because then the guns will be at home.
Of course, and that stuff is sexy for photo editors. So
yeah, I mean, exactly, it would be sexy, I guess, but it was such a stupid sight, and I'm sorry to be so judgmental, but I couldn't help it. But even the people posing for the image, they were in hysterics. They were laughing while doing this, and they had to be constantly be told, no, don't laugh, because
it's guns and it's supposed to be serious.
You can't be laughing while you're pointing your guns at my camera. You have to like, please turn. So I think those kinds of moments have affected how I'd like to make my images, and
it sort of shows you what you don't want to be doing in a sense, and then you sort of work from there, and you realize that you're eliminating certain kinds of images, and then once you've eliminated those, you have the ones that you can work with.
I mean, I think it's important to remember that this was a moment happening at a time when another kind of propaganda was also happening from the other side, as it were, that there's fitness, etc., and here are guns. I mean, they also want you to take pictures of their guns because they also want that side to go out. It's not like they want to be shown as weak and the underdogs. I might think, or some people might think, that they might be underdogs at certain points, but everyone has their agendas, as it were. So one should be, again, aware.
And awake, I guess, in some sense also.
Yeah, I mean, that's the most you can do. You're going to fall prey to it as well.
At some points, yes, but as I guess if you go with the intention of being aware and awake, then maybe at least half the time you won't.
One hopes
that at least half the time you won't get this thing. So another. I mean, back to the stars, of course.
Well, this is Samhaiya. He and I got chatting a lot, and I think I annoyed him a lot also, because this image, like, I really wanted an image of the stars, and we'd been listening to the radio, like, so that's one point, one way of being up to date that they have, right? So the radio is something that is listened to every day, and BBC radio, BBC Hindi is what they seem to listen to a lot. And so we're sitting there in the middle of nowhere and looking at these stars and trying to make conversation. And I hear this voice on the radio, which sounds really familiar. And sure enough, as I figured, it's the voice of a former professor of mine from college who also worked for BBC Hindi. I hadn't heard him on radio before, but sitting in the middle of this place, listening to someone that I have interacted with, and listening to Samhaiya tell me about how he listens to, this man regularly, it was like whatever, 6 degrees of separation or whatever it was, and I made some silly remark, and Samhaiya sort of cut me off, and he was like, you don't need to look for such major ways of connections. Your city runs on what I'm sitting on. So it's true. So that's what the whole conflict is about, right?
Yeah.
Resources. We
Yeah.
want resources. You're sitting on those resources.
It's a one
Uh,
degree of separation, literally.
yeah, exactly. You don't need to go this far. So I mean, I found it quite
That's
smart that he
it's
pointed that out.
profound. It's profound, actually. What
Yeah,
you said.
quite profound. And to make things, I don't know, uh, further layers. I showed this particular image to the astronomer I was mentioning earlier, and that bright spot in the middle of the sky
Right.
is apparently the center of the Milky Way.
Yeah.
So it sort of it brought this picture together for me at various levels.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah,
The center of India, center of the Milky Way. There's a mixture of different visual styles of film and digital, of color and black and white. So a lot of rules being broken as well. In this,
yeah,
which I like. I'm all for rule breaking. I don't want to this thing, but yeah, but it's also very beautiful because there are a lot of unexpected. There's a lot of unexpected imagery that we'll see also when we get to the book. But also here, where you see the implements. These I love the series of implements, and I personally have veered off from shooting, let's not say shooting or capturing, but for making photos of objects more than people. And I really appreciated this juxtaposition, of human and these very important implements, I'm sure, to their daily life.
right.
Uh,
Well, that's what I began. So one of the because I've been going back again and again. After a certain point, you start running out of like what do you point your camera at in some
right,
ways, right? I
right.
mean, um, I'm just talking about purely visually, not in
Yeah,
terms of content, like
of course.
in terms of what the issues are, of course.
Yeah.
Uh, so I wanted to make images of the possessions that people had,
Mm.
and you realize that I mean, it wasn't a surprise. I'd known this obviously, but people don't have that many possessions. So the possessions that you have are so few that they're all very. There's a purpose for each one of them. There's a radio.
And
There's
a
a
value, inherent value that
catch.
each
There's
one
a
has.
value exactly. Uh, and then another layer was added for me when I realized that in a lot of when the police comes to arrest a suspected Maoist,
Okay.
what are the weapons that they find? They find these weapons,
Okay.
these arrows, this pickaxe, that shovel, that hammer. These are classified as weapons found in someone's home.
Right.
Um, so
And then which are used
it
as
just added another.
and they use as reasons then to perpetrate violence on them or
Exactly.
arrest them or whatever, at least.
Exactly. I think the biggest violence is just the arresting. Data collected by various people working on the ground says that huge high percentage, 90 plus percentage of cases that are filed in the court are thrown out by the court eventually for lack of any evidence. But that process will take anywhere between a few months to a few years. So
And
the
meanwhile,
the whole process is the punishment.
yeah,
So if you support it, quote unquote, supported a Maoist because he came in and had food in your hut. I mean, it's not like you really had a choice there, number
right,
one.
right.
And but you will have to pay the price for that, even if you're not guilty of anything, by being sucked into a system which will take anywhere between a few months to a few years to release you. And
And
then
with
you have to incur the costs of legal help, of going to the court. In the book there's an image of one young Adivasi boy who had actually gone to the city, as he said, to work, and he had learned how to drive a tractor, so he was driving something over there, but he came back and he didn't like the city. And a few years after he came back, he was arrested in this case for digging up the road, it seems. And now he's stuck in that. So I mean, you just keep breaking someone who's already got enough to deal with in his life in this manner.
and
And
also,
there's a
I
lot
mean,
of
yeah,
there's a lot of displacement. So some of the images are just juxtaposed with the implements. Images I made towards the latter half of this project of people in Telangana and across the border from Chhattisgarh, in Andhra, people who had left during the Salvajidum and post-Salvajidum violence of 2006 to 10 or so. From Konta, basically I crossed from Konta, which is on Chhattisgarh, and toward then all the way up to Bhadrachalam I came. So in that belt, basically, various, I mean, there are people everywhere who you'll meet, and they're being chased, as it were, even now, because so they left because there was violence. So they left their land and they came somewhere else to clear some more forest and do a little bit of farming. But then the forest department will come and say, hey, you're destroying the forest, so you can't do this and you need to run from here. So you're constantly being displaced from place to place. This man, after a long conversation, the one before he, like, I spent half the day with him and I thought he was someone else. And towards the end of it, when he became more, I guess, comfortable, then he told me that actually he's a village level worker for the Maoists. And I was like, I've been taking pictures of you throughout, like, like, now you've ruined all the pictures because obviously I don't want to use one with your face, so like, because I've been asked this question about how do you feel comfortable about sharing pictures of the actual gun-toting, the gun-holding Maoists. And yes, it's complicated, and I'm possibly putting them
at risk
in some
because
sort of,
they can be identified by those.
Exactly, they're going to be identified. But I mean, one of course permission is taken. I mean, I've spoken to all of them, and they're quite willing. And a lot of them also did say that, listen, if this photo is found and I am found, then they'll kill me. I mean, if I'm found with this gun anyway, they'll kill me.
Right.
So
the photo isn't going to add any more.
A lot of them will also say that half the people who are killed don't have guns. Half the Adivasis who were killed by the forces don't have guns. So what difference does it make if this photo goes out? I'm already at risk. At one level. But in this particular man's case, because he was not an overground person, so I had to then explain to him that you can't spend the day with me, tell me nothing, and then at the end tell me, and then think that like there's no consequences to your allowing me to take photos. So like, just be sensible of that. So anyway, he had a nice cat. The image of the shadow is actually from a courthouse in Sukma, just outside the court. Courthouses are basically, it's like one small 5-room, 3-room structure. That's the court, and the young boy I was telling you about is part of this group. Necessarily not the guy with his hands up, but he's part
one
of
the
group.
shadows.
One of the shadows,
Then, of course, again, this recurring theme of oh my God, I mean, the very few places in India you'll be able to see this kind of a sky.
Exactly. I mean, I thought the mountains were the places, and like Leh and Ladakh. But even Leh and Ladakh, I must say that I've seen much clearer skies in central India, in the forests of Chhattisgarh, Bastar.
We've come to the end of the preview. What I can do is I can take you guys through a very quick run through of his book, because I don't want to reveal too much either. You guys should go and buy it when it comes out. And support Ishan's work.
For that, I have to bring it out first.
That'll happen. So if anyone out there, I don't know, the few people who are going to listen to this, if you are capable of funding this and enabling this project to come to light, please do, because it's very important work, and it's something that is done with a lot of love and care. So help out when you can. Or I just want to talk, just while I'm running through this, I just want you to talk about the book itself, and whether what you need for this book to come to life, what the process was when you decided that, okay, let's make a book out of this, in order to actually showcase the vastness of what this project is. Just talk to me as I go through the book.
Okay.
I'll try not to linger.
So I think just keep going fast. I'll keep talking. That's fine.
Sure.
I think I realized somewhere in the middle, the third, fourth strip, that this was not. This has so many layers. The situation has so many layers that it's not a photo story. It can't be 12 pictures or 15 pictures and now we'll know everything about everything. So
Right.
so I wanted to put together images from various situations which talk about certain issues, and then the images themselves lead to the other layers, as it were. So obviously there's mining, there's displacement, there's the violence, there's state violence, there's the Salwajudum question. There are questions of Adivasi culture being and languages being destroyed in this process, schooling of Adivasi children. So I wanted to put the images together, which is and they sort of I wanted to take someone uh, through a range of themes,
Right.
um, and so currently I'm basically stuck at a point where I don't know what the text should be. I'm not entirely sure if I want to go just the caption route, because that reduces it to those specific situations and experiences also.
Right.
I'm not sure if I, because that also then becomes like a easy way to discredit something. Oh, that particular situation we can counter with this or whatever. So I don't want to give you the counters already.
Yeah.
I want you to discover those counters yourself, I guess. Um,
And
so yeah.
and also have a kind of a flow through it that isn't necessarily governed by like you said, one particular narrative or one particular way of looking at it. It sort of brings to mind even this even the Seventh Man by
Mhm.
John Berger and Jean Mer,
Yeah.
and how a lot of times there's a sort of a parallel thing happening between the text and images, but not always do they sort of meet or sort of bolster each other up or whatever, as is traditionally done.
Right.
Which is
Right.
something I loved about this book as well. That there are surprises.
So
That
like this section sort
exist.
of, I mean, quite literally, I was I was looking at displacement and movement of people. So the way they travel from one place to another, which is largely on foot or
Yeah.
buses. Uh, I wanted to use that as the beginning and then take it somewhere else. One of the questions which um, I I ask a lot of people is how far that they have been from their village,
Right.
and the answers are really surprising, because um, I mean, they're not surprising once you know what the realities are, but if you haven't been 30, 40 kilometers away from where you were born, uh, that's a that you're confined to this tiny little space.
Yeah.
Uh, and that has effects on how you engage with authority, how
Right.
you look, how you can demand things from authority. Can you
Right.
demand things from authority? So I think those are that's the kind of information I was more interested in, uh, because obviously everyone has loss. I mean, there's anyone you ask, like, how has this affected you, they'll have something. Someone has died, something got destroyed, houses got looted,
Right.
burnt,
Right.
etc. But so you don't want to just get stuck on only those things, because yeah, it just
It sort of ends up becoming a very one-dimensional. I mean, even for that person, there's so much more to that than just that one thing.
yeah.
Then
This was I'd gone down a road in the morning, and the sign was up, which basically called for a meeting by the Maoists, and people were supposed to converge. By the time I came back, someone had taken that sign off and thrown it onto the onto the side. So there's this constant uh, uh, sort of shifting control over space, right? Similar to what the forces, what the CRPF, etc. are doing.
right.
uh, you 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 clear a space, then you hold the space. I don't know the exact military terms, but clear, hold, something.
Yeah.
So similarly, the Maoists do their own bit here.
And then the people, of course, who are caught in the middle are also trying to hold their own spaces by sort of
Yes,
not
in
drawing a huge.
in fact, it's probably someone who's fed up of
Yeah.
things, who's just torn it down and thrown it onto the
Yeah,
side.
I mean, if, like you said, if you've been put through the ringer when you're, taken into custody, and then, you're under trial for however long, and you're suffering for years with this thing, you have a catastrophic expenditure because of that. The last thing you want to see is some reminder that's going to again cause this whole sequence of events to have to sort of reoccur or whatever in your life or anyone's life around you. So a tiny state, vastly, very, very important in the context of India and what we take from that state in terms of its natural resources, which is why all this is, of course, like you've mentioned before, why all this is happening. And with that, we come to the end of the book. You guys, like I said, don't cheat and go and pause on the video. Please go and buy the book. It's going to be something that is very special that you can have with you. I know I'm going to be one of the first people to order it. Of course, now that Ishan's given me so much of his time. So now I'm moving into slightly more broader themes